Hello everybody. In this screencast we're going to look at using SQLite in our Android project. And when you are dealing with SQLite, there are a couple of concepts that you would like to be aware of. One of them is the SQLite Open Helper. So this Open Helper is a class that we have to extend, and that Open Helper is what we're going to use or going to pass on to the SQLite system when we want to actually open a database. And when you open a database, there are different stages. Maybe the database doesn't exist, or maybe the database version has updated. So you have a specific version of schemas or tables, specific types of tables, and then you updated them. So basically you have to change the version, and the Open Helper will identify that the version has changed, and then it's going to update the database, right, or upgrade the database. And so basically that's the class that handles all of this, meaning this class is, as the name implies, is the Open Helper. So let's look at the Open Helper first, and then we are going to look at the data access objects and implement the data access objects. So now, right click, I'll create a new class. I'll call it, for example, my database helper. Okay, here is my database helper, and it will extend the SQLite Open Helper. All right, here it is. And it's not happy because you have to implement some methods. So you go here, implement methods, and on create and on upgrade. Okay, so we'll look at them in a little bit, but you could see that it's not happy still, and it needs a constructor. Okay, cool. So now let's create a constructor. All right, I'll pick let's say the one that has the let's use this one. Okay, so now again, if we look at it, this is the database helper. I'm going to remove that. That's the constructor. Let me create my own public database helper, and let's say I'm going to pass it the context and call it context. So that's the context that I'm going to be passing, and then I'm going to use super, and this is the parent class, and these are the different ones. I'll use the type that actually this type. Okay, here it is. So here it is, the one that needs the context. So I already have the context. And then after the context, let's see, after the context, what else is needed? The name of the database. So basically, the name of the database, you create a final static string, and that becomes the database name, and just a constant. So I'll call it notes database. We'll create a notes database. Okay, we're going to create a final static integer, and that becomes the database version. Okay, and let's say we'll do version 1 to start with. So now basically here, when you look at super, right, if you go here back again, Command P, it tells you that the name, the first one is the second one is the name, the first one is the context, and then the name. So I'll say database name, and then the factory, I'll just say null. And then the version, it's the database version, right? Database version. So basically I have the constructor set up. Now everything is fine. So here it is. So now look at, there are two main functions here, or callbacks. One of them is the onCreate, the other one is the onUpgrade. So basically what happens is that the onCreate is going to get called if the database was never created before. So there is no database file that is stored on the system. So when the system starts, it tries to find the file that's called notes.db, and it can't find it. So basically, in that case, it's going to call, the opener will call the onCreate. And that is the time when you have to create the tables, initialize your tables, and so on, right? Now, that's when the onCreate is going to get called. The onUpgrade is when the version that is, so there is a file that is in the system, right? Let's go, it's notes.db, and the file has a version, which is the database version, right? So basically, it has a version that's stored in that file. And if that version does not equal the version that is listed here, then the onUpgrade is going to get called. And usually the onUpgrade is going to get called when the new version, which is the whatever new version you're trying to open the database with, is greater than the old version. And this function is going to get called. And then onUpgrade gives you a hook to actually store or back up your current database, or do some kind of analysis over the data, whatever you want to do with the database before, because after the onUpgrade is get called, then most probably there's a newer version of the database that's going to get created. So that's the onUpgrade. And then after the onUpgrade is called, then the onCreate is going to get called by the helper. All right, so these two functions here, we're going to create the database, and here we are going to upgrade whenever we want to upgrade. So that's all for the database helper for the time being. Now let's go and create a Java class, and we call it the note DAO. And the note DAO enables us to, so I'll have a notes table. So here is notes table, right? Let's create a notes table class. That notes table class is where we're going to store, for example, the column names, the name of the table, and also we will create two functions. One of them is the onCreate and onUpgrade, just to give you an idea of what we're going to do. So basically, let's say static final, and I'll call it, for example, string, and that's going to be the table name. Okay, and I'll call it, for example, notes. So that's the table name, right? And then similarly, I'm going to give it some columns. So let's have, for example, okay, that's a column, and I'm going to call it, for example, ID, right? So this is the ID, okay, and another column, right? And that's, I'm going to call it, for example, the subject. So each note will have a subject, right? And then each column also has, for example, each note has some text, right? So here's the text, right? So that becomes, and then the column ID, I'm going to call it ID, and then the notes, I'm going to, this is a subject, okay, and similarly, this is going to be the note, right? So that's the actual note, right? All right, so we are trying to create a database that's going to store notes. Each note will have an ID and will have a subject and will have some text, okay? Now, we already have now the notes, the column names defined as variables here, and also the name of the table is defined as variables. Now, when we are going to, we'll create a static public method, we call it, and it doesn't return anything, and we're going to call it onCreate. Right, so basically this function I'm going to call whenever I want to create this table, not create a row, I just want to create the table itself. Now when you look at the database helper, the onCreate gives you an instance of the database. All right, so that's what I'm going to use also here. I'm just going to copy this onCreate from here, and it's going to follow the same approach. So basically it's going to get a SQL database version, okay? Now, or a SQL database instance, right? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually write the schema creation code for this table. So basically to do that, I'll just say use a string builder, which will allow me to create it using the string builder. New string builder. Okay, here's my string builder. And now I want to create. So I'll say sb string builder.append, and I'm going to create table. This is the SQL that allows me to create a table. And here's the notes. I want to create a table, notes, and this is the table name, create table. So basically, ultimately, what I'm trying to write is this. I'm going to try to write something like this. Create table, notes, right? And then I'm going to insert here the different values. Like, for example, the ID is going to be an integer, primary key, and auto increment, right? Comma, and then it's going to be the subject. Subject is text, and I'll say not null, so that it has a value, it has some value. And then also I could say, for example, the note is a text, not null, right? And I can close this, and that becomes my create statement. So that's exactly what I'm trying to do here. So basically here is the string builder, create table, note name, so that I can add the note's name, which is coming in from here. And maybe I'll just add to it a to open the bracket, so this bracket here, and that becomes the first row. And then I'll do the same thing, sb.append, and then similarly I'm going to do what I already have added this part, right? So I could do now the ID, which is the column. Here is the column ID, and then basically it's going to be the column ID is integer primary auto increment. Here it is, integer primary auto increment. Here we go, and I can have the comma here and semicolon. Okay, and similarly I can add the other ones. Here it is. So I added integer primary auto increment, and I can have the subject. So that's the column called subject. Here's the column called subject, and it is text and not null. And here we go. Here's the text and not null. Okay, and similarly I can add the other one, which is the note. So basically this is not this one, it's going to be called the note, or the text for the note. Here it is, and note text not null, the same scenario. And then at the end I just add this one, close the bracket and semicolon. So that becomes my the string that represents the string at the top, right? So here's my string. Now I did that. Now what I could do is I just do a db.execute, and I'm going to execute the SQL that is here, which is sb.toString, and that takes the whole string buffer and does that, okay, and implements it. So now this is one scenario. Now you have to keep in mind that when you do db.SQL execute, this could actually cause an exception. So now to catch that exception, you have to have a try catch to catch the exception. So now if you look at, I have opened up the open helper. No, I wanted the database. And what we're going to do is let's look for that function called execute SQL. Here it is. And if you execute SQL, it throws an exception. See, it could throw an exception. So basically what I could do is I could just surround this by a try catch block, right? Try catch SQL exception, right? Okay, and this is Android database, so we'll do this SQL exception, right? And we call it here, and here we are, and this is exception, right? So here we are, we can call it like this, and basically we could just come here and just say exception.print trace, so that we just see what the issue is. So now here we are, we just created a string to represent the create statement for the database, and you can go and look at the SQLite documentation to find how to write that string. But anyway, so you could see here we create a table, and we use these variables because these variables allow us to change the column names and so on, and it will change directly in the string, right, whenever we want to change it. Now, and here we go. So that if you call this function, it's going to create the database, right? So, okay, good. So now we also want to create another function, okay, and that function is going to receive also a very similar function, right? Here we are. But we're going to call it the onUpdate. So instead of onCreate, we'll call it onUpdate, right? And in the onUpdate, basically what I want to do is this function is whenever you want to update this database. So basically, I'm just going to do something really, really simple. Usually we will follow the same exact, I can copy the same exact pattern that we have for the helper. Here it is, same pattern as the helper. Now, basically, I'm going to use something really, really simple. All I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the database. Basically, when the update happens, I just want to delete the database. So I'll do the same scenario. I'll just do a try and a catch, because I'm going to just call the delete. Okay, so here is the SQL exception. Okay, so now in here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to db.execute SQL, and I'm going to delete the database. So I'm going to say drop table if exists. Okay, this is standard SQLite scripting. Okay, so here it is, the drop table if exists, and then basically I want to now write the table name, notes table dot table name. Okay, so here we are. So basically drop table if exists, and I just give it the table name, and it's going to drop that table. Okay, so that's basically what happens here, and I'm just also going to print the exception. If there is ever an exception, I can also print it to the stack so I can see where the issue is. So you could see here the onUpgrade and the onCreate, right? Okay, good. So now if we go back to the helper, here is the onCreate, and what I'm going to do in the onCreate, I'm just going to do the notes table dot onCreate. You can pass it the database, and then similarly here I'm going to call the notes table onUpdate, onUpgrade, right? I'm going to pass it db and then the old version and then the new version. All right, so basically I just now trickle down this event to the notes table so that I figure out what to do with this table, right? And in our case, the creation code for that table is here, right? And the onUpgrade code for the table is here, and the onUpgrade in our case just deletes the table from the database. All right, good. So now that's the helper, right? Now, before we actually do something about it, now what we could do is, now we want to use this opener, right? Okay, so now let's use the opener just to give you an idea of how we are going to use that opener, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a database manager. So create a new class. I'll call it my database manager, right? So here is the database manager. Here's my database manager. And in my database manager, it will get the context. Okay, it needs the context because we're going to use it, right? So here's the context, right? And then it needs to store also a reference to the SQLite database. Here's the SQLite database. I'm going to have the SQLite, this is the database, right? So that's basically it, right? And then do we need the helper? Yes, let's get the database open helper. The database helper, and we'll call it, for example, the DB open helper, right? So that's the database open helper, right? So we have now just references to them. Now we create a constructor. Let's say public database manager, all right, and then it gets only the context. Let's say the context. Okay, here we are, and it could, so whenever it's being created, we just go in and do this .m context equal context, right? And then basically let's create a DB helper, DB open helper equals new database helper, right? That the one we created, and we pass it the context, right? We pass it the context. Now this is, we have the database open helper. Now we want to get a database instance. To get the database instance, we say db equals, and we use the database open helper. We say, for example, get writable database. Okay, here it is. And this will trigger the creation, the opening of the database. If the database exists, it's going to open, right? And it's not going to call any of the functions, right? Instead, it will just open the database and get you a reference to it. If the database does not exist, then the onCreate is going to get called, right? The onCreate for the database helper is going to get called. If the database exists, but the version numbers are not the same or not aligned, then the onUpdate is going to get called, and then the onCreate is going to get called. Okay. So now this is the database. We want to create a writable instance of the database. Here we are. Okay. And we will look at the other parts of it, but that's how we can get an instance of the database. Let's say in the main activity, I can come in here, and for example, I could do a database manager. Let's say a DM, right? I'll call it DM. And in the onCreate here, I could just say DM equals new database manager, and I could pass it this, which is the context, and here we go. So I have a database manager. See? So now this, when I do this, it should actually call what? If we go to the database open helper, if we have a logd here, right? And let's say tag, we just create this tag. Final string tag, and let's call it demo, right? So now this is gonna be called onCreate. Okay, now we go back here and add another one here, and this is the onUpgrade. So now let's see, whenever you create the database for the first time, the onCreate is gonna get called. We don't have the database, so let's run it now. I'm going to run it. Here's look at. Let's look for demo. Okay, now we want to get onCreate got called. So the onCreate is called. Now when you run it again, run the app again, no onCreate got called because it's already there. It's already created, right? Let me now bump up that version number. From version 2, I'll make it from version 1, I'll make it version 2, and I'll run it. The onUpgrade got called. Okay. So now it seems that the onUpgrade is going to get called. So in the onUpgrade, we can do this. We could say, I'm going to upgrade the database, and then after that, I could do node_table.onCreate, pass it the DB. So basically, this one will wipe clean the database, and then it will create the database. Let's run it again. Now, nothing is going to happen because the version number. So now let's make the version number 3. Right? Run it again. And you could see that the onUpgrade got called, right? So this onUpgrade function got called, and in the onUpgrade, we are onUpgrading and then onCreating. Perfect. So now you could see the operation of this. Actually, there's another function that you could also use. It's called the onOpen. See? And that also gives you an idea when the database is opened, right? So basically logd and onOpen. So now when you run it, this onOpen is going to get called every time because you're opening the database. See? onOpen, right? Now when you do, let's say, version 4, and I run it, now it will be onUpdate, onUpgrade, and then onOpen gets called. All right, perfect. So you could see that when a database is opened, it could have different stages. If there isn't any upgrade that happens in the version, then onUpgrade is going to get called. If the database was never created, then the onCreate is going to get called. Otherwise, the onOpen always gets called because when you try to open, it resolves the upgrade or resolves the creation, and then it opens the database, right? Okay, so that's only if there is no errors in your code. So let's say, for example, I go here and I'm going to change the creation code. I'll remove that space, okay, between the table and the table name. Now when you run this, and I want it to force to create, so basically I have to go to the helper and just bump up the version to say, let's make it version 5, because this means that there is an upgrade, and then the upgrade deletes the database and then creates it, right? So let's run it again, and you will see that there will be an error. Okay, let me remove this. There should be an error here, and you could see here there is an error that happened. SQLite near table and notes, because it needs a space, syntax error in the SQL. Very nice. So we just go and fix our syntax error, and here we are. Okay, so cool. So that shows you how we can create. There is no syntax error now, right? Okay, so now let's go back to, we looked at the database manager, we looked at how the opening of the database and the closing of the database happens. We can also show you the file where the database actually got created. It's a file that gets created. We will look at the end of the video. Now what we would like to do is, let's look at how we actually could query this database and get stuff out of it, right? So basically we want to query the table, right, and get data out of the table. To do that, we need to create something called the data access object. The data access object has all the queries that we would like to implement, and it is also going to be abstracted into objects. So basically when the query is executed, it will return, for SQLite, it will return something called a cursor, and we have to actually transform this cursor entry to a Java object so that we could use it, right? So let's create our Java object. Let's say our Java object is going to be a note object, right? Here is a note. Here's our Java object. And we know that the note has, let's say, we can make them public, private, whatever. Let's say we have a long integer and we call it ID, right? That's our ID. And, sorry, it's a long, not an integer, long. Let's say ID, right? And that's 1, right? So that's our ID. And let's say we have a string, and that becomes the subject. And we have another string, and that becomes the text of the note, right? So that becomes our note. And we can have a constructor that actually we could use, and so on, right? So let's create getters and setters. Let's say we get our getters and setters for each one of them. And we can even create a constructor. Let's create a constructor. Where is the constructor for all of them? Here we are. And we can create a public, the default constructor note. Just create an empty one. Okay, here we are. Okay, so basically we created our constructor. Let's also create a toString so that you could see them. Let's create a toString with all of them. So that's a string object. That's a note object. Here it is. We have the note object that represents a note, right? Now, to host all the code that we need for the queries and so on for the note, we create another class. We call it the notes DAO, data access object, right? So basically any queries we want to write, we are going to write them here, right? And for the DAO to function, we know that we need the SQL database. So basically let's create a SQLite database, which is going to be hosted here, and the constructor receives the database. So let's say here is our constructor, which actually is going to receive the database as a parameter, and it sets it to the local parameter and so on, right? It's stored in the local parameter. Let's say, for example, I want to save. So let's say I'm going to save, let's say public long. Let's start with void. So basically I'm going to save a note. So I want to save a note to the database. That becomes my first function, right? So here it is. I'm going to save a note to the database, right? That's what I could do. Let's say, for example, I could do also update. So I could have another one, which is update, right? Something like this, right? So the save, usually when you save a note, you don't know its ID. The ID, in our case, if you look at the notes table, we created it as an auto increment, right? So basically, it's an auto increment, meaning it's automatically going to be generated, the ID. So basically, let's say when you save, you want to get back the ID of the node that you saved, right? So basically, it's going to return, let's say return, just to stop it from giving us an error, I'm just going to say return 0, just for the sake of, just so that it stops showing the error. So basically, this long that's going to be returned is the new ID of the node that you just created, right? So that's one option. The update is maybe we can also return a boolean to tell you if it was updated or no, if the update was successful or no, right? Return, let's say true, just or false, whatever. So just to avoid it from so basically we want that the update is just to update the node that is in the system, right? Okay. Now delete, same story. We can have a delete, right? So basically, let's copy this one, and we go here, and this can be the delete, right? So you have a delete function, right? So that you give it a note, it deletes it from the database. All right. So now you can also get a note by ID. So basically, we can say public note, get me a note, get, and you pass it a long ID, and it's gonna get you a note by ID, right? So basically, return null just in case, right? So basically, this is the get a note by ID, right? Or you could also get a public. You can get a array list of note, get all, right? Get me all the notes, right? Let's say we create an array list of notes equal new array list, and I'm going to return that. All right, so basically that's, and then we have to write the code to do that, right? Okay, so you could see these are the functions that we need, right? So now we need to save, and we need to write the SQL that is required to do these operations, and this is all boilerplate code, but we look at how to do that. And you could see here we have all the CRUD operations. So we have the create, right? We have create, CURD. We have the create. We have the create. We have the read. We have the update, and we have the delete. All right. So we have all these operations. So now let's do the save. So basically, the save means that you're going to be passed a note value, right? And you want to save it, right? So to save, what we want to do is we are going to use some the insert statement. So you see here when db.insert, and you can see here that the insert requires the table name, requires some form of values here that are going to be stored, right? So or whatever, this is a column hack, so we're usually going to put this as null, and then the content values. The content values is the key value pairs of what values you're going to store, right? Okay, so now let's have a look at it. So we need the content values, new content value, and call it values equal new content values, right? Here it is. And basically what I'm going to do is we'll say values dot put. It's a hash map, it's a map, and then basically the key is the column name. So we'll say notes table, the notes table, and I'm going to store what, for example, the subject, and that's going to be the note dot get subject, right? So that becomes the subject. So I'm going to store the subject. Similarly, I'm going to say values dot put, and that also the notes table, and I'm going to store the text. Okay, and that's similarly going to be note dot get text. I'm not going to store the ID because the ID is automatically going to be created based on the auto increment option, right? So basically the same story. I'm going to do db.insert, and you could say the insert returns a long, and that long is the ID of what you just inserted. Okay, so I'm going to insert in the database. The first one is the database name. I'm going to get it from where? Notes table name, right? And then this null, I'm going to just do this as null, and then the content values are the values that I'm going to insert. And here we are, that returns it. So basically I could also return here, I could just go ahead and return this. So basically because it's going to return the long, which is the ID of what you just inserted, and that's your save, right? So that is the save function. And you could see that I just looked at it, figured it out by just doing db.insert. And you could say here, insert, and the only thing that I'm not aware of is this null column hack. So basically let's look at it from here. So basically the SQLite exception, or the SQLite database here, I could just go here and say, for example, insert, and we can find the insert function. Here it is. Here is the insert. What does it return? It returns the row ID of the newly inserted row, or -1 if an error has occurred. Perfect. And this one is a string optional, maybe null. Okay, does not allow inserting completely empty rows without naming at least one column name. If you provided the values, that is empty, no column. So in my case, this is not important. I'm just using the content value is a map that contains the initial column values for the row. The keys should be the column names, and the values are the values of the column. Okay, perfect, which we did here, right? So perfect. So this is perfect here, right? All right, so we did the save. Now we want to do the update. Okay, perfect. So is there an update? So basically db.update, and here it is. The only difference in the update is very similar to the insert, but the only difference in the update is there is a where clause. Why? Because when you update, you have to tell me which row you would like to update, and which row or rows you would like to update, right? So we will need a where clause, and so basically there is a where clause, and then there are arguments of the where clause, and we'll look at how to do that. It's very simple. So now let's do this, the update, and then it needs the table name. Okay, notes. Just 1 second. So basically this is the update. It needs the content values, same story. So I'm going to copy these content values from up here, put it here. So it needs the content values, because you see here the update, and you can see here it needs the content values, right? And then it needs a where clause, which is a string, and then a string array of where arguments. And we'll look at how to do that. It's very simple. Okay, here's the update, and the table name is notes table name, and that becomes the table name. All right, here it is. And then the values, here are the values, right? And then we want to update. So basically when you update, you're passing on a note that already has an ID, right? So basically we come here, we'll say, for example, the where clause is, we'll say ID. Okay, we can also use the same, I could use the table, just to avoid hardwiring anything, notes table. And I need the ID, column ID, right? Okay, I'll say the column ID equals, question mark, and then comma. This question mark means that I have a parameter that I would like you to query, and this question mark is indicating that there is a value for that parameter, which I'm going to provide in the next argument here of this function. And this is, they are saying that this is an array of entries. Okay, cool. So basically this is an array of strings, right? So basically I would like to create an array here that includes this. Okay, so now to do that, okay, we could just say, we can do it like this. So let's say we say a new string array, all right? And then inside here we are going to insert the value. It's not a string, actually. These are string values. Let's see db dot update, and yes, it's a string. You see here there is a string array of where arguments, right? Cool. So basically we'll do that, and basically what we need to do is we need the ID. Okay, so the note dot ID, get ID, and that becomes this. It's not happy because we need to cast it to a string. Okay, rapid value of, and here we are. Okay, now let me just use more space so that you could see this. Okay, now what is happening here is, this is the table name, right? This is the values, right, which is the values that you want to update, and this is our clause, where clause, which is that the ID is equal to something, right? And whatever this something is, we create an array, because you can have multiple parameters, like for example, and for example, the subject equals something else. In that case, you add that other parameter to your array here. And this is an array that includes the value. So because you only have one question mark, you have only one value in the array, and that value is the ID. Okay, so basically we are just making sure that you update only the ID. Now, if you look here at the update function, right? Now, if you look at the update function here, where is that here? The update. Okay, here's the update function. Now, if you look at the update function, here it is, and you can see here it's the where clause may include question marks, where in the where clause, which are replaced by the values from the where arguments, right? That's exactly, and this is the number of rows that are affected. So basically, if the update happened, if this is greater than 0, right? If this is greater than 0, this means that an update has happened, right? So I could do something like this. I could return, if the update happens, right? So this means that the return value is greater than 0, and in that case I could just return that, right? So that's how you do the update, right? Cool. Now the delete is very, very similar. So you see here db.delete, and the delete, you don't need any values, but you need a where clause and some where arguments, right? And it returns an integer. It's probably the number of values that were deleted, right? So the same story. So the delete, okay, is going to use the table name, notes.table name and table name, and then it needs the where clause, right? So I'm going to use exactly the same code here, right? Here it is. So basically the where clause is that the where clause is that the ID is equal to the ID of the node that's being returned, and the ID, I'm just putting it in the array here. And the delete returns a boolean. I just say, and let's say, so the delete, does it return a boolean? It returns a boolean. So cool. So I can just say return that, right? Okay, and here we are. It's not happy. It's not returning a boolean. So let's see, what does delete return? Yeah, it returns an integer, number of rows deleted. Okay, so we could do that, return this, and do the same story, greater than 0. So now what we have done now is we are able to save a note, and we're able to update a note, and we're able to delete a note. All right, so these are the functions that we have, right? Okay, cool. So now to get a note and to get a note, we need to now query, right? So basically to get a specific note with an ID, we need to write a query, right? And we'll look at how to write a query in a little bit, but what we need to do is, you see here, if we try to write a query, let's say we are going to return a note. So let's say start with a note, that's what we're going to get back, right? So let's say null. We start it off as null, right? And we're going to return that note, right? So at the end of the day, we're going to return that note. Now, if it exists or if it doesn't exist and so on. So now, to do this, we need to do a DB query. And you could see that the query returns something called a cursor, right? So that cursor is, it's a pointer to the first record of your returned result. And then that cursor, you could just go and then read the values from the cursor that the cursor is pointing to. You can read its values, and then we're going to populate it into a note object, right? If it exists, because you might ask for one that doesn't exist, right? Okay. So now to do that, to write that query, you could see that in SQL, the query has a lot of components. One of them is probably the where clause. What columns are you interested in? What is the selection criteria that you want? And if you have a selection, this is the where clause. Selection, this is selection query, and then this is the selection arguments. You can also have group by, you can also have having, or you can also have order by, and so on. So these are all parts of the query, right? But at the end of the day, the query is going to return a cursor. And you have to think about what to do with that cursor, right? Okay. So now, an interesting thing is maybe we can write a function that actually constructs a note from a cursor. We can look at that in a little bit, but at the end of the day, we need to handle cursors. Okay, so let's see. So let's look here at DB query. Okay, so here is the query. Like when you look here, oops, sorry. All right, so now let's look at query. All right, let's pick this one, for example. All right, so basically, it's going to return a cursor, right, which is positioned before the first entry. Note the cursors are not synchronized, blah, blah, blah. Okay, good. So now, what's going to happen is that if that cursor is positioned at the top of the, it's positioned at the entry before the first one, right? Okay, so let's do this. So basically, what we are going to do is, let's have a look. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is maybe we can look also at the documentation of the cursor so that you could see what it is. But anyhow, I need to write this query. So I'm going to look at something that is the ID is equal to this ID. I'm looking for a data. Okay, so let's say db.query, right? And I need the database name, right? Table name. Okay, let's do this again. Sorry, db query, right? It needs the table name. Okay, cool. So I need the table name. Table name is notes table dot table name, right? I have the table name now. Now it needs we enter the table name. Now it needs the a string array of columns. Okay, cool. So I'm going to do new string array of the columns. So the columns, where I'm going to get them from, let's say I'm interested in all of them. So notes table dot ID, right? So they say the ID or the column ID, right? I need the ID column. I also need the notes table. I need also the, let's say, the text, right? The text column or the subject. Let's get the subject. And let's then, after that, the notes table. I need also the text column. Okay, cool. So I got the ID, get the column names, right? So these are the column names, comma. So I got the column names. Now I need the selection. Selection is the where clause. So I will use exactly the same where clause that we had here, right? I'm looking for something with a specific ID. And I'm going to copy this, but I'm going to update it a little bit. So now you need, so basically this is the query. Here it is. Here we are. Let's put an enter here so that you could see this. Put another enter here and you can see this. So basically what we are doing is we just need the note with that specific ID and then comma. And now we already entered the selection criteria. Now we need a new string array which has the arguments. What is this question mark, right? Okay, cool. So now we'll do the same thing. New string array, right? And that's going to be the note or not ID. We already have the ID that is being passed, right? And that ID we could do the string value of, right? String dot value of ID, right? So we can do that. Okay, here we are, and this is the query, right? This is the query, and then this is the value of the query, right? So now what is left? So we go back again, comma. What is left? Group by, we don't have a group by, null, right? What is left? String having, null also. Order by, null. Let's say that because we're looking only for one value. Here we are. So that's our query. That's going to be a cursor that returns a cursor. Here's a cursor. We call it cursor, and here we go. Okay, here's my cursor, and here we go. Okay. All right. So here's the cursor. Very nice. Now let's have a look at this cursor class. So here's the cursor class. Now provides read, blah blah blah, and so on. And then basically, if it points to the entry before the first entry, so there is probably move to first, right? Move to the first entry. So basically, this is move to first, moves the cursor to the first, and then basically it just moves the cursor to the cursor, and actually it returns a boolean whether the move was succeeded. So if the returned result is empty and you ask it to move to first, then what's going to happen is that it's going to return a false, right? So basically what we could do is, okay, so we can come here, we could say if cursor dot move first, move to first, right? Then we can continue, right? Then this means that we can go and do something, right? So now, if we move to first, this means we are pointing now to the first entry, right? Now we want to go in and actually get the note, right? So basically, we move to first, right? And now, if it's successful, this means the cursor holds something in it, right? So now we can create a note equal new note. So we create a new note, okay? And then basically, we could say note dot set ID. And how do we do that? We get C, which is the cursor, right? Now the cursor, we could say dot get long. What is the column index? This is column index 0. Why is it column index 0? Because we put the ID on the 0th, is the first entry, right? If you look here, the ID is the first entry, right? See here, the ID is the first entry in the table, right? And then after that is the subject. So we can do the same thing, but you have to pay attention to the type. Node.set subject, which is the cursor, dot get what? Get string, and column index is 1, right? Similarly, note.set text. See, the text is the last one here. We will do the same thing. Cursor.set get string, and the column index is 2, and we're good to go. So that's your note, right? So basically, that's how we can read a note. So we move to first, and then we get one note. We know that we're going to get one note, and that's the case. If you move to first and the result is empty, then when you move to first, it's going to be false. And in that case, we return a note, and that note is null anyway, which we're good, right? So that's how we can do this. So basically, we can write a small function here, which we call it, for example, let's say private. We call it, for example, note build note from cursor, right? Something like that. So basically, we give me a cursor, okay, and I give you back a note, right? So basically, we'll say note, right, equals, let's say, for example, let's say we create equal new. Basically, you're gonna get a cursor, right? And what we could do is we can just do this, right? Copy this guy from here to here, right? And that becomes my note. Right, here it is. So we create a new note, and from that cursor I manage to populate that note, and then just return the note, right? So I can do that. So now instead of having that code here, right, I'll just say note equal to build cursor from note, and I pass it the cursor, right? So basically I could just, because I'm going to reuse this, I know that I'm going to use this again here, right, when I'm getting all, right? Because getting all, this means I have a cursor, and then I have to loop using that cursor, and then I'm going to get a cursor. So that the cursor, I need to translate it into a note, right? So here it is. I just moved that code from here to here. I have refactored that code into this function that I can reuse. Okay, perfect. So now, same story with this guy. This guy, you have exactly the same, but we're not going to have any where clause. So basically, I'll have the exact same thing. I want every single one of them. So basically I need all the columns, but I'm not going to have a where clause. So I'm going to remove the selection, and I'm going to put null here as a selection is null, and the arguments are also null. Okay, so basically it's exactly the same, right? But I don't have a filtering clause, right? So basically get me all the, this is telling it get me all the nodes, right? So basically now I have a cursor, right? Now what I could do here is you need to have a while statement. So basically I could say cursor dot move first. So I can do that, right? So now it's moved to the first, right? And the idea is that because you are moving to the, so basically what I could do is you could say cursor dot move first, right? Okay. Now we are at the first now, right? So basically we're at the first entry, right? And what we could do is we could say now what we could do is we could say we could have a while statement, while cursor dot move next, right? So now instead of using move to first, we could say move next, right? While cursor move to next, this means that there is some next. So basically if you go here and there is move next, move last, move the cursor to the next row, right? This method will return false if the cursor is already past the last entry in the result. Okay, so now what we are trying to do here is we are trying to figure out if there is some form of data or no, right? So now what we can also look here for maybe another function that we could use to, this is move first is null, this null is when that the whether is the value is null, is last, is first, right? And so on, is closed, before last, before blah blah blah. So basically there are a lot of functions that we could use. So one option is just to keep it moving like this, meaning move to next, right? And so on, right? So I could do it like this, right? And yeah, so what we could do is something like this, or what we could do is we can move it to first and then do a check to see if you are if there is data or no. But let's say we move next while there is a next, right? While there is a next, then we continue, and then here the cursor, you have it. So basically I could say I could have a note equals build node from cursor. So I have the cursor already, and I could say notes, right? Notes dot add note, basically this, and then move to next. So this is going to continue to move to next as long as things are happening, right? Now the interesting thing is that we have to check to see is that what happens when you say move to next, and when it is at the top, when the cursor is not pointing to the first entry. You know, here it's pointing to the first entry, before the entry before the nurse, the first. So when you tell it to move next, it's probably going to move to the first entry, and we're gonna test that. Okay, so you could see here that this is how we do get all. All right, so now let's go and test this stuff, right? So let's say, for example, here's the main activity, right? We got this DM guy, right? Let's say we create some nodes. So it's a DM dot create dot, so this is the data manager, right? Okay, cool. So now the data manager has no access to the nodes object, right? So basically what we could do is the data manager can create an instance of this node object, right? So because you see here the nodes DAO, these are all functions that we have, right? So basically in data manager we could also create a nodes DAO, right? And we can call it nodes DAO, right? Here it is. And then basically we can pass it the nodes DAO equals new nodes DAO, and it needs the context, or it needs the database. Here's the DB. Okay, here we are. So it has an instance of the nodes DAO, right? Okay, so we can also have a getter and setter and so on here for the nodes DAO. Okay, here's the getter, and this is the nodes DAO. Okay, main activity, I could do dm dot get nodes DAO dot, and let's say we save a new node. Say for example new node. Okay, and I'm going to add some text here and some text here, and here we go. So basically the new node, let's have a look again at the node. Let's create one which we create a new node without the ID. I'll create a new node without the ID. You just pass it the subject and the text. Here it is. Okay, so now here's the subject and the text, and let's say for example subject 1, let's say text 1. So I'm saving these. Here's 1 and here's 2, here is 3. So basically I'm going to store 1, 2, 3, and similarly here 1, 2, and 3. Okay, cool. So here we are. Okay, I'm going to save them, right? And then similarly I would like to query. So I'll say, let's do this first, just start off, right? So now in the database opener, I want to just make sure that I have the database and all of that interesting stuff done. So I'll go here and maybe bump up that version a little bit, do 6, right? And let's look at what we're doing here. We're getting data management manager. We're just saving 3 nodes, right? Okay, cool. So now after we save these 3 nodes, I want to actually get them. So I'll say dm.getDAO.getAll, right? And gets me some nodes. I'll say log d maybe, and I'm just going to print whatever I'm getting back. And that's a list, right? So here we are. And let's create this tag so we know we're going to use it. Final string tag equal demo, right? So I'm going to do this. Now, okay, let's run this and see what happens. So we run it. And our lockat. Okay. Here we are. Let's say. Okay, cool. So now you could see that these are the they are coming in from the database. See here, this DEO, we created these 3 and we are getting them all here, right? So it seems that everything is working fine. So here is the first node, the second node, and third node. Now if we run it again, basically it's going to create another 3, right? And when we do this get all, you will get actually 6 now. See, you're getting more. See here, the IDs are automatically incremented. So you are getting 6 now. See? Now, what if I want to delete one of them? Let's say I want to say after I save, let's remove these saves now, right? Because we already have 6 in the database now, right? Now I'm going to do dm.delete.getDAO.delete, and I want to delete a specific node. So basically, I could delete this by a node if I have the node with me, or I can just even create a function that deletes by ID because I don't need the whole node. Let's go back to the DAO, and I could create another one very similar, but you pass it an ID. Here it is, and you pass it an ID long, and you're gonna pass it an ID, right? And then basically instead of all of this, string value of, and it's ID and so on, right? So basically it's just you're passing it an ID, right? Okay, so now let's go back again here. I want to delete, so I'll say dm.getDAO.delete, and I'm gonna delete the first one. Okay, so now if you look here, if you look at the whatever we're getting back, the first one has an ID of 1, right? So basically what we're doing is that we're just saying delete the ID of 1, and I can even delete the other one. So basically let's do this one, and I'll also delete the ID of 2. Okay, so the first 2, I'm going to delete them. And then when I get all, they should not come back in the result. So because I deleted them. So go here, and you can see here, we deleted number 1 and 2, and then the one with ID 3 is still there, and so on. So I have the nodes. Very simple, very straightforward. Now you want to update, let's also update. So let's say dm dot, let's get that object first. Let's say we get the third one, right? Let's say we get the third one. So we say note equal dm dot get getDAO dot get with number 3. We get us number 3, right? And then we say note dot set text. I'm going to set maybe its subject that it is going to be updated subject 3, right? And then I could say dm dot update, dm dot get DAO dot update the node. Okay, cool. So what I'm doing here is I am updating that node. So basically I'm getting the node from the database, updating its subject, and then I'm telling the database to update it, and then I'm getting them all. So just to show you. So basically here we are trying to delete things that don't exist. Let's see if this breaks. So it's not going to break. It's going to return null. So basically here, fine. So these 2 deletes didn't actually happen. And you could see here that the update has happened. See? The update has happened only for that node. Here's the update, right? So we did demonstrate what? We did demonstrate the delete. We did demonstrate the update. We did demonstrate the save because we created some. We did demonstrate the get specific one, which is here. See, we are getting by. See, we're getting that specific node. And then we also get all. We did demonstrate it. It's very straightforward, and you could see how we are playing with the database. Now, if I change anything in this database, I change anything in the structure of the database, I have to go to the opener and change its version. You see here, when I change the version, then things are going to be different. When I change the version, it's going to delete the database because our code deletes on upgrade deletes the database, and then on create will recreate the database. That's fine. Now, when you look at the activity here, you will see that we are trying to delete some things that don't even exist. This note is going to come back as null, right? And then when you try to do this, it's going to break. So that's what you need to do is whenever you're doing this, you have to do if note is not equal to null, right? Then you do something, right? Then you are going to do this. Does it make sense? If the note is not equal to null, and then get all. So now let's run it and see what happens. I did bump up the version number. It was 6. Now it is 7. When we run this, what's going to happen is, all right, perfect. And you could see that on upgrade got called, right? And then on open, because on open is now the database is open. Then the on create of the database, of the activity, this one is called, and there is nothing in the database. And you see it did not break because the null, we took care of this null option. If you don't have that check, let's say we move this from here and put it here, and we run this, it's going to break because what's going to happen is that you're trying to do something to a null. See here it did break. See, it says fatal transaction. You have a null pointer exception. You have to take care of these things, right? It's because we know that if the node does not exist, you're looking for something which has ID 3. If it doesn't exist, then you're going to get a null, right? Based on our code here, you see our code here, it starts off as a null, right? And then we get a cursor. We move to the first. If that is true, this means there is data. Then we go and get the note. Otherwise, you're just returning the note, which is originally a null, right? So you have to take care of these situations. But anyway, this is very straightforward. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.